All right, everybody. Welcome back. Let's go ahead and get started. This is the Dharma Doors, and this is the San Francisco Dharma Collective. And tonight, we're going to read another sutta. Um, as you know, we are still making our way through the Middle Length Discourses. Tonight, we're moving on to Sutta number 90, and this is going to be the last sutra in the section of the sutras to kings. So if you've been coming for the last, well, I guess maybe the last 10, because this is the 10th or last 9 Dharma doors, we've been making our way through this little collection of teachings that the Buddha gave. Not all of them are teachings to kings. Some of them, they just feature kings in that way. But what we've been noticing is that this little group of teachings, this little group of suttas, they definitely have a kind of a through line. Like they have an interesting focus in a lot of ways that's kind of in a way different than the suttas that we were looking at before. So of these 10 suttas that are part of the Rajavagga, the little section of kings, a lot of them we have now realized, a lot of them are about this one particular king, King Prasanadi. So, King Prasanadi, he's the king of a region called Kosala. Kosala is where Savatthi is, where the Jeta Grove, Anathapindika's park is, and it's Kosala is where a bunch of these sutras have taken place. And so the king of Kosala keeps popping up. Now, one of the things that we're going to realize, especially if you've been coming to Dharma Doors now, we're going to realize actually that this seems like it should have come earlier. And what we're going to notice is that these suttas, they don't seem to be in chronological order. Like, because if you remember a couple of Sundays ago, we read one where the Buddha was on his deathbed, and both the king and the Buddha were in their 80s. Actually, they were both 80. This one, we're sort of back in time, and King Prasanadi is almost like still kind of feeling out the Dharma a little bit. So we're just going to kind of want to notice that. I think it's actually interesting to notice that in the Buddhist tradition, chronological order is not a very important thing. And it actually always makes me wonder or make me think about the kind of modern Western obsession with chronological order, as if there's no other way to imagine time or imagine importance. I'll probably have a little bit more to say about that once we get into it. But otherwise, we're going to revisit King Prasanadi, and we're going to go visit the Buddha because the king has questions and he wants answers. So I hope everybody's excited, looking forward to a little Dharma tonight. Um, let's go ahead and dive in and see what's going on. So, again, if you got here late or if you're just getting here now, we are in the Majjhima Nikāya. We're reading Sutta number 90. Sutta number 90 is called the Kaṇṇakatthala Sutta. Kaṇṇakatthala is where the sutra takes place. So, we've seen this a lot, right? That sometimes sutras are they're called the name of where they take place. Sometimes they're called the name of the person the Buddha is talking to, or sometimes they're called the topic, like whatever the topic is. So this is the kind of sutta that's being called where it takes place. So this is the Kaṇṇakatthala Sutta. Thus have I heard. On one occasion, the Blessed One was living at Ujjunya in the Kaṇṇakatthala Deer Park. a deer sanctuary. Now, on that occasion, King Pasenadi of Kosala had arrived at Ujjunya, for some business or another, right? And then he told somebody, "Come, good man, go to the Blessed One and pay homage in my name with your head at his feet, and ask whether he is free from illness and affliction, and is healthy, strong, and abiding in comfort, saying, Venerable Sir, King Pasenadi of Kosala pays homage with his head at the Blessed One's feet, and he asks whether the Blessed One is free from illness and affliction, and is healthy and strong and abiding in comfort. And by the way, say this to him. Say, Venerable Sir, today King Pasenadi of Kosala will come to see the Blessed One after he has had his breakfast." "Yes, sire," the man replied, and he went to the Blessed One, and after paying homage to him, he sat down to one side, and he delivered the message. Now, the king's two wives, who happened to be sisters, by the way, so the sisters, Soma and Sakula, they heard, "Today, King Pasenadi of Kosala will go to see the Blessed One after he's had his breakfast." So then, while the meal was being served, the two sisters went to the king, and they said, "Sire, pay homage in our name with your head at the Blessed One's feet, and ask whether he is free from illness and affliction, is healthy and strong and abiding in comfort, saying, Venerable Sir, the sisters Soma and Sakula pay homage with their heads at the Blessed One's feet, and they ask whether he is free from illness and affliction, and is healthy and strong and abiding in comfort." Then, when he had finished his breakfast, King Pasenadi of Kosala went to the Blessed One, and after paying homage to him, he sat down to one side and delivered the message of the sisters Soma and Sakula. And the Buddha replied, "Great king, could the sisters Soma and Sakula not find any other messenger than the king of Kosala, right?" And the king replied, "Venerable Sir, the sisters Soma and Sakula, well, they overheard that today King Pasenadi of Kosala would go to the Blessed One after he's had his breakfast. And so then, while the meal was being served, the sisters Soma and Sakula, they came up to me and they said, 'Sire, pay homage in our names with your head at the Blessed One's feet, and ask whether he is free from illness and affliction, if he's healthy and strong and abiding in comfort.'" And the Buddha replied, "May the sisters Soma and Sakula be happy, great king." Then King Pasenadi of Kosala said to the Blessed One, and this is question number 1, "Venerable Sir, I've heard this. The recluse Gautama says there is no recluse or Brahmin who is omniscient and all-seeing, who can claim to have complete knowledge and vision. That is not possible. Venerable Sir, do those who speak thus say what has been said by the Blessed One and not misrepresent him with what is contrary to fact? Do they explain in accordance with the Dharma in such a way that there's nothing that provides a ground for censure and can be legitimately deduced from their assertions? Great King, those who speak thus, they do not say what has been said by me. but they misrepresent me with what is untrue and contrary to fact. Then King Pasenadi of Kosala addressed his son, General Vidudadbha, saying, General, who introduced this story about the Buddha and omniscience? Who introduced this story into the palace? It was Sanjaya, sire, the Brahmin of the Akasha clan. Then King Pasenadi of Kosala told somebody, Come, good man, in my name, tell the Brahmin Sanjaya of the Akasha clan, Venerable Sir, King Pasenadi of Kosala calls you. Yes, sire, the man replied. And he went to Sanjaya, the Brahmin of the Akasha clan, and told him, Venerable Sir, King Pasenadi of Kosala calls you. And then we're actually going to move on a little bit. Or actually, we still have a little bit to go on this question of omniscience, but I want to pause here really quickly. So let's see if we can figure this out tonight. This sutra is a little mysterious, and if you read the commentary, and not like not old commentary, but if you read like modern commentary, a lot of people seem to think that this sutra is like the sutra doesn't make any sense. And what I mean by that is that they seem to think that it's a little stitched together. Because like there's like one thing going on here, and then like this whole Sanjaya the Brahmin, we're not going to hear from him for a little while. Like this is about to disappear. But I'm not so sure about that. Not that I know exactly what's going on with this sutra. I'm not sure what's going on with the other wives, Soma and Sakula, and, them conveying their, you know, reverence to the Buddha, but doing it via the king. I feel like there's something there. Like, I feel like it's trying to say something, but I'm not quite sure what it is. But the first question, if you didn't catch it, it was the king saying, Is it true that you say nobody's omniscient? That nobody attains omniscience? Is that true? And the Buddha says, Nope, that's not what I say. And then, part 8, meanwhile, King Pasenadi of Kosala says to the Blessed One, Venerable Sir, could it have been something else that you said referring to omniscience and that somebody understood it wrongly? In what way does the Blessed One recall making such an utterance? So, have you said something about omniscience that maybe somebody got wrong, right? And the Buddha says, I recall having actually made the utterance in this way, great king. There is no recluse or Brahmin who knows all, who sees all simultaneously. That's not possible. And the king says, what the Blessed One has said appears reasonable. What the Blessed One has said appears to be supported by reason. There is no recluse or Brahmin who knows all and sees all simultaneously. That's not possible. And that's going to be the end of the question or the little conversation about, it's called sarvanya. So sarva jnana, all knowledge. So you smash sarva jnana together and you get sarvanya. Sarvanya is this word that's omniscience. And we've actually encountered this idea a few times before. There's a couple of different sutras also in this collection that they don't go into a lot of detail, but they are about the idea of omniscience. And this sutra definitely seems to be relying on those earlier sutras because it's not going to tell us much more about this. But what it is that in an earlier sutra, there's a conversation about the leader or the head of the Nigrantas. The Nigrantas are the modern Jains or Jains. And in the time of the Buddha, they were known as the Nigrantas. And the Nigrantahas, the head of them was a guy named Nataputta, the Nigranta Nataputta. And that guy claimed to be omniscient, but he claimed to be omniscient in a way where he knows everything and can see everything all the time, simultaneously. And there's a conversation where somebody's like, hey, Buddha, like, aren't you omniscient? Are you omniscient like the Nigranta Nataputta? And the Buddha basically says, no, nobody's actually omniscient like that. That's what he's referring to here. He's saying nobody is omniscient that way. What it eventually says, though, and this is, by the way, if you're interested in all this, this is in Sutta number 58. But in Sutta 58, again, in this collection, the Buddha says, yeah, it's not that I am omniscient in that I know everything right now. I'm omniscient in that I can know anything. And then he uses this example, and it's a beautiful example, and I want to share it with you quickly. The guy that the Buddha's talking to is a prince, and he says to the prince, he's like, yeah, you know everything about chariots, right? Like you know all the different parts of a chariot and what they do. And he's like, yeah, I know everything about chariots. And he's like, so do you know everything about chariots right now? Or is it that if somebody comes up to you and asks about a certain part of the chariot, you can tell them about any part of the chariot? And the prince says, oh, yeah, it's not that I know everything right now, but if asked a question, I would know the answer to anything about chariots. And the Buddha says, yeah, I'm like that, but I'm like that with the Dharma Dhatu. I'm that way about the realm of dharmas, which is that if you ask me anything about anything, if you ask me anything about any dharma, I would know the answer. But I don't know it all the time. I only know it sort of like on demand. So it's like sarvanya on demand, right? So that's the backstory that is missing from this. They're only talking about the Buddha denying a kind of simultaneous omniscience. So that's the king's first question. This question of like, do you say there's no such thing as omniscience? So Noam has a question about is the whole omniscience thing about upaya or the being answering questions?
Yeah, sort of knowing it as needed, that's related to paya,
Um, I mean,
or is it a more of a time thing?
yeah, I would put this more of a prajna wisdom thing. Now, it may be that the Buddha uses that knowledge upayakly. Like if somebody has a question and the Buddha is going to answer it in a skillful way, that's upaya, which of course is going to require the sarvanya, but I wouldn't put them as exactly the same thing, if that makes sense, Noam. Yeah. Okay. So again, the king had this kind of question about the Buddha's understanding of omniscience, but there was another thing going on in there, though, too, which is about a rumor. It was like a rumor that was spread about the Buddha saying this thing about omniscience. So then the king has a question like, well, where'd this rumor come from? And he asks his son, General what's his name? Vadubbaha. He asked the general, and the general's like, oh, this other guy told me. And then the king says, well, bring that guy to me. And then that just disappears for a moment. It does come back, but that's sort of the end of the omniscience conversation. The king has a second question. And by the way, this second question, this is what I feel like is the heart of the sutra. Like that this is the real like main teaching in a way. So the king asks this. He says, you know, there are these four castes, right? The kshatriyas, the nobles, the brahmins, the vaishyas, the merchants, and the shudras, the workers. He asks this very important question. Is there any distinction or difference among them? And I love this sutra because I actually think it's very, very funny. I think the Buddha's hilarious. Frankly, I think he's like so funny. So he says to the king, like in this question of regarding the castes, is there any difference? And the Buddha says, yeah, there are these four castes, great king. The noble kshatriyas, the brahmins, the vaishya merchants, and the shudra workers. He says two of them, that is the kshatriyas and the brahmins, they're held to be superior since people pay homage to them, rise up for them, and accord them reverential salutation and polite services. And the king says, uh, Venerable sir, I wasn't asking about the present life. I was asking about the life to come. There are these four castes, venerable sir, the noble kshatriyas, the brahmins, the vaishya merchants, and the shudra workers. Is there any distinction or difference among them? Meaning in the next life, right? So it's like, is there any difference between like rich people and poor people? Oh yeah, rich people have all the money. Rich people get into all the parties. Yeah, that's the difference. It's like, and the king's like, well, yeah, I know that. I know that the kshatriyas and the brahmins are socially revered and socially respected. I know that. But I mean, like, is there any real difference between them? But what he says is, right? Oh, yeah, no, I meant, is there any difference? Um, sorry, I lost my spot, but in the life to come, right? Right. I wasn't asking about this life, I was asking about the life to come. And the Buddha says, Great King, there are these five factors of striving. What five? Here, a bhikkhu has faith. They place their faith in the Tathagata's enlightenment thus. They think the Blessed One is accomplished, fully enlightened, perfect in true knowledge and conduct, sublime knower of worlds, incomparable leader of people to be tamed, teacher of gods and humans, enlightened Blessed One. That's the first factor of striving, that they have faith that Buddha is enlightened, that he's the Blessed One. Then they are free from illness and affliction. They possess good digestion that's neither not too cool nor too warm, but medium, and they're able to bear the strain of striving. Then they are honest and sincere, and they show themselves as they actually are to their teacher and to their companions in the holy life. Then they're full of virya. They're full of energy. They're full of drive, determination in abandoning unwholesome states, and they are energetic in undertaking wholesome states, steadfast, launching effort with firmness, and persevering in cultivating good, wholesome states. Then they are wise. They possess wisdom regarding the arising and ceasing of phenomena. Wisdom that is noble and penetrative and that leads to the complete destruction of suffering. These are the 5 factors of striving. And there are these 4 castes, great king: the noble Kshatriyas, the Brahmins, the Vaishya merchants, and the Shudra workers. Now, if they possessed the 5 factors of striving, it would lead to their welfare and happiness for a long time. All right, let's have a quick convo about the 5 factors of striving, as it's called. So, we've actually encountered this teaching one time before, not too long ago. In fact, where was it? It was in Sutta 85, actually. So part of this same Rajavaga collection, Sutta 85, I guess, was what, Prince Bodhi? Yeah, so the Buddha was talking to Prince Bodhi, and he gave the teaching to Prince Bodhi about these 5 factors of striving. So really quickly, just to get us in the mood for the rest of the sutta, I want to kind of remind you like of some ways to think about these five things. The first one is this idea of shraddha, or faith. And yes, they put it as like having faith that the Buddha is actually enlightened. I would understand that. I do understand that as it's not exactly about faith that the Buddha was actually enlightened so much as I feel that it's faith that this works. That like it's not just like wishful thinking that it might work. No, no, somebody did it. The Buddha did it, and he really is enlightened in that way. He really did end suffering, and therefore it's possible. And what I'm emphasizing, or what I want to emphasize with this idea of like faith, and by the way, when we talked about Sutta 85 a few weeks ago, I went into much greater detail about these 5. So if this piques your interest, you can go back a few weeks. But this idea of faith in Buddhism, it's not like Christian blind faith in that way, where you're sort of believing just on faith in a way. In a Buddhist context, faith, I like to say, the word shraddha, it's much more about a sense of certainty or like confidence. And what we really want to be thinking about, we want to be thinking about the mind or the mentality that is doubtful. So the opposite of faith is doubtful. And in particular, the mind that is like, you know what? I don't think you can actually end suffering. I doubt that that's possible. And what we want to notice is what an obstruction that doubt can be. Because if you don't think it's possible, it's probably unlikely to happen then. Whereas if you have a sense of certainty or confidence that it is at least possible to end suffering, then having that faith is very important to realizing that. So I just want to show or point out how doubt, and by the way, in Buddhism, doubt is a nivaranya. It's an obstruction. It's a hindrance. And I kind of want to point out that it's a hindrance not because Buddha's up in heaven all mad at you for not believing, right? It's a hindrance psychologically in terms of like, if you don't actually believe it's possible, it'll probably never happen. So that's the first one about having faith that this is going to work. That's a good factor of striving. Oh, and by the way, I've been trying to find out what the actual I'm trying to learn Pali. I don't really know Pali, but I'm getting better. And what I can tell from the Pali is this language of factors of striving. It's definitely about um, the five things that are conducive to the path is what it says. It's conducive to the marga or the pada in that way. So that's what these five things are sort of about, is these are the five factors or the limbs. They are called anga, by the way. And so these panchanga, five limbs, are what help us on the path. So the second one, interestingly, is good digestion, but by extension, healthiness in that way. And the Buddha, I've mentioned this before, the Buddha focuses a lot on digestion, a lot on food and diet in that way, especially like what we moderns call intermittent fasting, right? The Buddha seems to have invented intermittent fasting in that way because everybody else, it was either you don't eat or you eat as much as you can. And so for the Buddha to be like, how about once a day? It seems to be one of the first people to suggest such a thing. So that's the second aspect or the second factor that helps us on the path. Good digestion, healthy diet in that way. The third, satya, truthfulness, honesty. Once again, I'll say I would like to repeat this one. In Buddhism, truthfulness, it is not because Buddha's up in heaven, like really hoping that you are honest. In Buddhism, it is literally about the mind and what we would call a duplicitous mind, right? Where you have multiple realities that you're juggling. The one that I'm fabricating and the one that I know to be true. And I know this one's true. That's why I'm fabricating my lie. So to lie is to be in these two realities. And from a Buddhist point of view, it divides the mind and it makes dhyana impossible. Your mind has to be unified. It has to be integral, integrated. So lying is about the mind. Again, it's not actually in a way, these ideas of morality are problematic because again, it's not a God or a Buddha up in the sky. It's more complicated than that. So the fourth of these, though, I want to focus on just because of it's going to pop up a little bit later. So the fourth factor is virya. I like to translate virya as drive, like being driven. It's usually translated as either energy or determination. Those are the two main ones that you see. I like I like the idea of drive because for me personally, the way that I use English, if you're driven to do something, it's not about the goal and it's like I can do nothing but do it. Like I'm driven to do it. And for me, that's the feeling of the energy of virya. It's not goal oriented and it's not a burden. It's that you are driven to do it. And what you are being what's being encouraged here, and almost always with virya in Buddhism, you're being encouraged to abandon unwholesome states and you're being encouraged to cultivate wholesome states. In other words, be good. You can do it. You can do whatever you're trying to do, and you know what you're trying to do, and you know what's good for you. You can do it. And that's the virya, is this sort of like, yeah, I can do it. I can, again, whatever it is that you're struggling with that is unwholesome and you're trying to cultivate wholesome, I'm here to tell you, you can do it. So that's the virya, the drive. And then the last is the wisdom, pranya in that sense. And specifically, both in this sutta and Sutta 85, where this was introduced originally, or at least in this collection, we want to understand that in the early Buddhist tradition, so in the kind of Hinayana, panya, so pranya, is always about the wisdom that understands the arising and ceasing of dharmas. In other words, it's about impermanence. It's understanding that all dharmas come and go, and they all come and go. And everybody knows that, by the way, but there's this funny thing that happens, which is that a lot of times when dharmas reveal their impermanent nature, it pisses us off. It upsets us, it gets us sad, it gets us depressed, or whatever it is. But what did you think they were going to do? Stick around eternally forever? When have you ever seen anything ever stick around as it is, unchanging forever? It just doesn't happen. The nature of all phenomena is comes and goes. That's how this is working. And there's a way that to be wise is to just be living in accordance with that reality. And the friction, the dukkha, right? And remember, dukkha means like an axle that's not moving smoothly. So there's this friction, and the friction is the mind rubbing up against impermanence. And the mind being like, stop being impermanent. So that's the specific kind of connotation of wisdom, at least in the early suttas. It's understanding arising and ceasing of dharmas. All right. But we're not done with the question yet. So the king asks, is there any difference between the castes? And the Buddha says, of course there is, right? Two of them are revered and two of them are not. And the king says, no, 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 I don't mean like now. I mean in the next life. And the Buddha says, well, there's these 5 factors of striving. And what I say is that of the 4 castes, if they cultivate these 5 factors of striving, it would lead to their welfare and happiness for a long time. But the Buddha's, of course, still being funny. And so the king has to then follow up and say, Venerable sir, there are these 4 castes, the noble Kshatriyas, the Brahmins, the Vaishya merchants and the Shudra workers. Now, if they possessed these five factors of striving, would there be any difference among them here in that respect? So the king's asking, okay, let's say they've all practiced, they all practiced the five factors of striving. So they're all equal in that way. Now, is there any difference among them? Meaning, like, if Brahmins practice the five factors of striving, is it better than if a Shudra practices the five factors of striving? And the Buddha responds, "Here, great king, I say that the difference among them would lie in the diversity of their striving." So, for example, he says, suppose that there was two tameable elephants, or two tameable horses, or two tameable oxen that were well tamed and well disciplined. And let's say that there was two tameable elephants, or tameable horses, or tameable oxen that were untamed and undisciplined. What do you think, great king? Would the two tameable elephants or tameable horses or tameable oxen that were well tamed and well disciplined, being tamed, would they acquire the behavior of the tamed? Would they arrive at the grade of the tamed? And the king replied, "Yes, venerable sir." And would the two tameable elephants or tameable horses or tameable oxen that were untamed and undisciplined, being untamed, would they acquire the behavior of the tamed? Would they arrive at the grade of the tamed, like the two elephants or horses or oxen that were well tamed and well disciplined? "No, venerable sir," the king replied. "So too, great king, it is not possible that what can be achieved by one who has faith, who's free from illness, who's honest and sincere, who's energetic and driven, and who is wise, it's not possible that what can be achieved by them can be achieved by one who has no faith, who has a lot of illness, who's fraudulent and deceitful, who's lazy, and who is not wise." And the king replied, "What the Blessed One has said appears reasonable. What the Blessed One has said appears to be supported by reason. There are these four castes, venerable sir: the noble Kshatriyas, the Brahmin priests, the Vaishya merchants, and the Shudra workers. Now, if they possessed these five factors of striving, and if their striving was all right, was all the same, would there be any difference among them in that respect?" And now we get our final answer. "Here, great king, in this respect, I say that among them there is no difference. That is, between the deliverance of one and the deliverance of the others." Suppose, for example, someone took dry sakka wood, lit a fire, and produced heat. And then someone else took dry sala wood, lit a fire, and produced heat. And then another person took dry mango wood, lit a fire, and produced heat. And then someone else took dry fig wood, lit a fire, and produced heat. What do you think, great king? Would there be any difference among these fires lit with different kinds of wood? That is, differences between the flame of one and the flames of the others, or between the color of one and the colors of the others, or between the radiance of one and the radiances of the others? No, venerable sir. So too, great king, when spiritual fire is kindled by virya energy, lit by striving, there is, I say, no difference. That is, no difference between the deliverance of one and the deliverance of the others. And the king replied, what the Blessed One has said appears reasonable. What the Blessed One has said appears to be supported by reason. So, like I said when we started this little section, I feel like that's sort of the crux of this sutra. It fits in very well with a lot of the other sutras that were about caste or class. A lot of the same questions about the equality of the castes. Um, this is something that people make a very big deal about, and I think rightfully so. People make a very big deal about the fact that the Buddha was, well, the Buddha, they say, you'll find people that say that the Buddha was anti-caste. I'm not quite sure that he was anti-caste so much as he was anti like castology. I just made up that word, by the way. But like the theology of the caste system, which does say that the Brahmins and the Kshatriyas are like actually spiritually pure, literally more pure than the lower castes. This is the castology or like the theology of the caste system, is that they are literally more pure, more spiritually advanced. Basically, the idea is they've been through the reincarnation process more and therefore have moved up the human chain ladder more. That's what the Buddha seems to be denying. But he doesn't make any, like anti caste statements like we should abolish the caste system. The Buddha, actually, at least the Buddha of the suttas, he's in the woods. he's, I'll tell you, I mean, it's the Buddha didn't say it, but the Buddha would probably say, render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, which is, of course, a line from Jesus from the Bible, but that's the secular world. That's the line from the Bible about let Caesar have those coins, his pictures on them. That's his business. It has nothing to do with me. The Buddha seems to have taken a lot of the same position in terms of like, he doesn't say like, let's change society. He just is saying, hey, we're over here if you have a problem with society. We're over here doing something else. So. And my favorite line of this particular sutra is when the spiritual fire is kindled by virya, lit by striving. There's no difference. The difference is in the striving. And I would definitely want to suggest, of course, that everything in this sutra that's being said about the caste system, I would say goes for the sexes as well, that it's not a matter of male female, it's a matter of striving in that way. Okay, on to the next question. Cool. And again, this is where some people, some commentators, they read this as like a bunch of different things stitched together because these questions are like all of a sudden now King Personage, all of a sudden, he's like, oh, and are there gods? That's his next question. Are there gods? And this is after his question about like, is there a difference between the caste system, right? So it does sound like he's kind of all over the place, but I don't know. I think has questions. And so he had a question about the Buddha's type of omniscience. He had a question about how the Buddha sees the caste system. And now he has a question about devas, about divinities in that way. So the Buddha, in response to that question, are there devas? The Buddha asks, why do you want to know? So he says, why do you ask, great king? And King Prasanadi says, Venerable Sir, I was asking whether those devas are reborn and come back to this human state, or whether they do not. Great king, the Buddha replies, those gods, those devas, who are still subject to ill will, they come back to this human state. But those devas, those gods who are no longer subject to ill will, they don't come back to this human state. There's more to this God business, but I just want to focus one step at a time. So this is actually a big issue in the world of Buddhism, or I should say in the world of early Buddhism. And the issue, the question, are the gods subject to rebirth? Or what the king is asking is, does being a god, does that mean that you're no longer subject to rebirth? It was a commonly held belief at the time of the Buddha, at the time in India. It was basically a commonly held belief that if you got out of here, meaning you got to a heavenly realm, then you were not coming back to the human realm. It is a Buddha insight. It is a Buddhist insight to basically say that that devas, it's not that they will always come back, but it's a very important part of Buddhism that gods can get angry too, gods can be desirous too, and gods can be confused. So those are the three poisons, those are the three kleshas. And the whole thing about Buddhism is that the gods suffer just like everybody else. What they talk about, though, which is I find actually fascinating, the way that the Buddhists talk about gods, it's sort of a lot like we kind of might think of people who have a lot of wealth, which is the ability to distract oneself indefinitely. And that idea that you can distract yourself indefinitely, it's the idea that that equals liberation, or that that equals actual joy or actual happiness, just because you've prolonged it in that way. And what the Buddhist point of view is that that actually is unsustainable, and that if you don't actually get rid of greed, anger, and delusion, it will always eventually kind of, those three will eventually rear their ugly heads and eventually take even a god, and they will eventually be dragged back down and reborn as a poor schmuck human being. So that's what the first part of the question is the king wants to know, if I get to a god level, will I get out of here or not? Or like, will I be permanently out of here? And the Buddha says it's all about ill will, actually. By the way, really quickly on this note, I just want to plant a seed before we kind of go further in this. You could you could think of this. How can I put this? This is an interesting idea if I can articulate it. You could think of it as a god, but if a god starts to get too pissed off, so too much vyapada, right? Too much ill will, then they get reborn as a human, right? So you could think of it that way. Or if you wanted to get kind of weird about it, you could flip it into like, this is what anger looks like. So it's not that a human being is the fate of the angry, it's actually what the angry looks like. Like that, in that way. So just kind of a way of thinking about reincarnation in that sense. Because, by the way, there's a sense that ignorance is crawling around on all fours, that's what that looks like. So there's a way in which this is what anger looks like, or what desire looks like in a way. So we just call it human or something. But okay, so the Buddha answered the king by saying, nope, if you're free of ill will, that means you're not coming back. And if you have ill will, that's a recipe for coming back. And when this was said, the king's son, the general, Vidudabbaha, so General Vidudabbaha asks the Buddha, Venerable Sir, can those gods who are still subject to ill will and then who then get reborn and come back as humans? So, Venerable Sir, can those gods who are still subject to ill will and who come back to this human state, can they topple or banish from that place the gods who are no longer subject to ill will and who do not come back to this human state? But then the Venerable Ananda had this thought. Get a load of this guy, right? No, he says, this General Vidudabbaha is the son of King Pasenadi of Kosala. I'm the son of the Buddha. I'm the son of the Blessed One. He says, this is the time for one son to talk to another. And so Ananda said to General Vidudabbaha, General, I shall ask you a question in return. Answer it as you choose. General, what do you think? There's the whole extent of King Pasenadi of Kosala's realm, where he exercises lordship and sovereignty. Now, can King Pasenadi of Kosala topple or banish from that place any recluse or Brahmin, irrespective of whether that recluse or Brahmin has merit or not, and whether they lead the holy life or not? And the general replied, he can do so, sir. And Ananda replied, or followed up, saying, and what do you think, General? There is this whole extent that is not King Pasenadi of Kosala's realm, where he does not exercise lordship and sovereignty. Now, can King Pasenadi of Kosala topple or banish from that place any recluse or Brahmin, irrespective of whether that recluse or Brahmin has merit or not, and whether they lead the holy life or not? The general replied, no, he can't do that. And Ananda followed up by saying, General, what do you think? Have you heard of the gods of the Trayastrimsha heaven? The gods of the 33 levels of heaven? Yes, sir. I've heard of them. And King Pasenadi of Kosala has heard of them as well. Ananda said, General, what do you think? Can King Pasenadi of Kosala topple the gods of the 33 levels of heaven or banish them from their heavenly palace? Sir, King Pasenadi of Kosala can't even see those gods. How could he topple them or banish them? Right? And Ananda replied, So too, General. Those gods, those devas, who are still subject to ill will and who come back to this human state, cannot even see those gods who are no longer subject to ill will and who do not come back to this human state. So, how could they topple them or banish them from that place? So, very, very important message there regarding, and again, this is also a very big part of the Buddhist message. In fact, it was evoked in the section on the 5 factors of striving, the first one regarding Shraddha or faith. So the idea that we should have faith that the Buddha's enlightened, awakened, that the Buddha is a knower of worlds, and then it lists all 10 titles of the Buddha. But the one epithet that I want to focus on is a Buddha is called a teacher of gods and humans. I stress this often, but it's because I can't stress it enough. The idea is that gods, rich people, all sentient beings, hell dwellers, Mara, the devil, everybody has greed, anger, and delusion. All of them, except a Buddha. And that's what makes a Buddha above and beyond even a god. And it's what makes, well, it's what makes you potentially beyond even a god, is your ability to get rid of greed, anger, and delusion. That if you were to actually not be angry, you would be more powerful than a god. And there's a way in which that takes time to appreciate, especially when, especially if you're in a culture or a cultural mindset that in a way it equates like power with things, or the idea of like, if I could just get angry enough, I can get what I want or whatever. And what the Buddha realized is that anybody who is angry is out of control. They're literally not in control of themselves. They have no discipline. They are not tamed. And so that's where the Buddha looks at even the gods and is like, oh, those poor people, those poor suffering gods. So that's what puts a Buddha in this very, very unique state. And again, what I think is really important to emphasize is that the Buddha is not unique in that. I mean, it is a huge thing to eradicate greed, anger, and delusion, right? So I'm not trying to make it sound like all we have to do is that. But there is a way in which it seems like it's right there. Like, in terms of, I guess what I'm trying to do, I'm trying to circle back around to Shraddha and trying to encourage you to have faith that this is possible. I'm trying to give you the virya. I'm trying to encourage you to do it in that way. So, this kind of rallying cry that you too can be more than a god. Like, it's a very, I don't know, it's a powerful thing. It's a powerful thing to think about. So, all right. Questions, comments, answers about being a god, being more powerful than a god. All right, let's finish up the sutra because we're pretty close. This is also this sutra is fun. This sutra has a lot of fun little things to it. So, um, after so after Ananda steps in and says it's time for one son to talk to another son, and then Ananda walks the general through all of that. Um, yeah, so Ananda does his thing. And then I'm over on page 739, section 15. After hearing that from Ananda, then King Prasanadi of Kosala asked the Buddha, the Blessed One, Venerable Sir, what's this guy's name? What's this bhikkhu's name? Oh, his name is Ananda, great king. And Ananda means joyful, by the way. That's like what Ananda means, is joyful. So the Buddha says, oh, his name is Ananda, great king. And the king responds, Ananda indeed. Like joyful indeed, right? So he says, Ananda he is indeed. And Ananda he appears. That's kind of like almost mystical there. Like if you get into like ta and suchness, this idea of like, and Ananda he appears. So his name is Ananda, and the king says, Ananda indeed, and he appears to be Ananda. What the Venerable Ananda has said appears reasonable, and what he has said appears to be supported by reason. And then the king has one more kind of follow-up question to all of this. One more question, Buddha. Venerable Sir, is there Brahma? Like, is there God? Because remember, Brahma is like the creator of the universe. Is there Brahma? Why do you ask, great king? Oh, venerable sir, I was asking whether that Brahma, whether he comes back to this human state or whether he does not. Great king, any Brahma who is still subject to ill will comes back to this human state. Any Brahma who is no longer subject to ill will does not come back to this human state. Again, before they were just talking about devas. Now they're talking about God. And again, Buddhism is kind of amazing for saying, nope, even the creator of the universe gets pissed off. And because he gets pissed off, he will eventually fall and be reborn as a human. And then all of a sudden, out of nowhere, we're back. And then somebody announced to King Pasenadi of Kosala, Maharaja, great king, Sanjaya, the Brahmin of the Asaka clan has come. King Pasenadi of Kosala asked Sanjaya, the Brahmin of the Akasa clan, Brahmin, who introduced this crazy story about the Buddha and omniscience to the palace. And Sanjaya says, Sire, it was General Vidudabbaha. But General Vidudabbaha says, wasn't me, sire. It was Sanjaya, the Brahmin of the Akasha clan. So they're doing the old, it wasn't me, it was him thing, right? And so, and then just out of nowhere, and then somebody announces to the king, Sire, it's time to get out of here. It's time to depart. And King Pasenadi of Kosala said to the Blessed One, Venerable Sir, we've asked the Blessed One about omniscience, and the Blessed One has answered about omniscience. We approve of and accept that answer, and so we are satisfied. We have asked the Blessed One about the purification of the four castes, and the Blessed One has answered about purification in the four castes. We approve of and accept that answer, and so we are satisfied. We have asked the Blessed One about the devas, about the gods, and the Blessed One has answered about the devas. We approve of and accept the answer, and so we are satisfied. We have asked the Blessed One about the Brahmas, and the Blessed One has answered about the Brahmas. We approve of and accept that answer, and so we are satisfied. Whatever we ask of the Blessed One, that the Blessed One has answered. We approve of and accept those answers, and we are satisfied. And now, Venerable Sir, we depart, for we are busy and we have much to do. And the Buddha replied, You may go, great king, at your convenience. And then King Pasenadi of Kosala, having delighted and rejoiced in the Blessed One's words, rose from his seat, and after paying homage to the Blessed One, keeping him on his right, he departed. All right. Any thoughts or comments, questions, ideas about this Kaṇṇakatthala Sutta? About any of the king's questions? It's an odd little sutra. I will mention one thing, unless anybody has anything. I did want to circle back around. I wanted to circle back around to, I guess it's, well, I'm going to circle back around to page 737. And it's the section where the Buddha is talking about um, the striving and this idea of the fire of virya and the striving, and the idea um, that there's no inherent difference between the castes. The only difference is in their striving. And then the Buddha, in order to emphasize this, he uses this example of four different kinds of wood and says, and of course, the four different kinds of wood are supposed to represent the four castes. And then he has this thing about, would there be any difference among their flame, their color, and their radiance? And, I know that, we're all probably, or some of you out there are maybe a little bit more scientifically minded in that way. And so you're probably sitting there thinking, oh, there would be a difference in their color, right? Because if you burn methane gas, it burns a different color than if you burn, phosphorus and these things. So the source of the fire does indeed produce a different flame in that way. I hear you. I know that too. And I actually think that misses the point. I think it misses the point. it sort of misses the point a little bit, and not that this is the point. I'll get to the point in a moment. But the idea of, is there any difference in their color, in the color of the flame? The the reason why that's kind of very significant is you need to know that the caste system, well, what it's actually called, because caste is an English word. And by the way, if you didn't, I don't know, maybe I did this when I talked about the caste system before, but the caste system, that word caste was used in the colonization of South America to refer to the different groupings of Native American tribes. And then mainly British colonialists used the language of caste that had already been used in South America. They used it to talk about what was going on in India. But in India, they don't talk about a caste system. What they talk about is the Varna system. Varna. And Varna means color or like shade in a way. And so there is a sort of there's an implicit understanding that the upper castes are more fair skinned than the lower castes or the lower Varnas. So the color was about skin tone in that way. I'm saying this because this reference to color is significant to a conversation about the Varna system. And the way that I understand this little section, and this is super interpretive, by the way. This is just, this is how I think. Unfounded. But in reading this, in reading this little section, I couldn't help but have a like a contemplation or a thought. And what it was is it was when I had the same thought that you probably had, which is nope, if it's a different kind of wood, the flame would be different, right? Maybe a different color or something like that. But what that got me thinking about though is not the flame, light. And it got me thinking about the color of light. It's kind of a weird idea, the color of light, because I know that you can, put it through a prism and you'll get the whole rainbow in that way. But what I'm kind of getting at is that what I'm kind of thinking about or what I was contemplating was about what we would call purification. And what I mean is that yes, the reason why the flame of one source would be different than the flame of another source is because of what we might call impurities. Impurities in the source would cause a different colored flame. But in terms of burning off those impurities, doesn't light at a certain point reach purity? I'm not saying it does. I'm sharing with you my contemplations of, does light reach a point of purity? Even is light the purification process itself? And once the coarse, gross, physical has been shed and it is just light, the reason why I'm kind of ruminating or thinking in this way is because I do think that that's what the Buddha is talking about in terms of the fire of virya. And that sure, if a Brahmin, a Kshatriya, a Shudra, and a Vaishya, they all start off in these different bodies, but through the purification process of striving, which is tapas, this kind of spiritual fire, yeah, it's going to be burning off all the impurities, but at that level of light, isn't it all the same in a way? And the way that you can think about this, even if you're into science and physics and that, the question is, if I have um, like phosphorus or some chemical fire here, right? And it's has a flame that's burning one color. And over here I have, let's say, just a wooden fire, and it's burning a different colored flame, right? And both of those fires are producing light. Is there like an impure light and a pure light? And do they like collide and mix with each other? Is that how light works? Or is light by nature pure in that way? And by pure, of course, what I mean is rid of gross physical impurities. It would seem that the Buddha is pointing that all four castes, once they burn off the impurities, what's left is equally pure, regardless of where you started. So, some thoughts about the nature of light and the nature of light as a spiritual metaphor for practice and purification or something like that. Questions, comments, answers, ideas?
Thank
Ophir?
you. I think it's a very cohesive sutra. I think it's very interesting also in the last end of the Kings, the section. I think you and the sutra have destroyed like religious authority or spiritual authority, in different ways. Each sutra was like doing that. And today it's very cohesive. It starts like, and we see it all, today it's so like amazing. Like that's what I love about the community of the Sangha is that, you know, the omissions, right? A person as a dude has a power, he sees everything is like that, they see everything, they have this supernatural. So you give them power and money, the omniscient and the class system, and then the gods, and the god like very cohesively creates this equanimity of like you talk about free will, the choice, and kind of
Mm.
destroy this giving power to these authorities and building it up like that. And there is a sense of humor that I also appreciate. I was like, he said it, somebody said it, you know, because this is how it starts, right? Somebody said it that, these guys, this community, they have this ritual, they have this power, and this create all this diversity and discriminations and authorities and castes. And it's so interesting, like the radical truth that the Buddha said, no, in the end, it's just like those fives, but all of us are in together with that. It's just like mind blowing that it was that radical, and it makes sense that it was prosecuted and is like destroyed, and then like fire again starts again and destroy it, because it's a quite a challenge to deal with in this world of hierarchies, and so relevant to these days.
Yeah.
So I really appreciate that. It's very cohesive, like the structural destruction that happened there in a positive way.
Yes. Couldn't agree more, Ophir. Yeah, especially the message of this is radical, 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 radical. Like, I think that there's a way that many of us are already on board with this message of like radical equality. I mean, especially in the SFDC, this is where radical equality just comes to be is right here. But I think for us, like that's so obviously right and true. But I think we need to remember that it's not everybody that sees that level of equality, especially in the world of religion that is so hierarchical. And so, yeah, for the Buddha to be coming with this message, and so long ago when these systems were probably even more instrumental to social um, structure, put it that way. So, yeah. Any other thoughts about this wonderful little sutta? Yeah, no.
Thank you, Ophir, for saying that. That was really beautiful. But just on a more personal level, I really appreciate the exhortation from you a couple of times that, this is attainable, we can do it. I mean, I don't know about anyone else, but I'm struggling with some, little bits of karmic habits, and it's just good to hear you can do it, I believe that. Thank you.
I believe in you all. I know it. We can do it. All right, everybody. So that concludes the Rajavagga section of the Majjhima Nikāya. So that's all. We did all 10. We did all 10 of the little king suttas. That means, oh, this should be interesting. So we're moving on to the Brahman Vagga. So the section to the Brahmins. And so a different social caste, not the kings, not the kind of the highest in that way, but the Brahmins. So that'll be interesting. We'll do that starting next Sunday. And by the way, I wanted to let everybody know really quickly, next month in July, it is going to be on July 20th, Sunday. I'm going to be doing an in-person day-long meditation retreat at the San Francisco Dharma Collective up in San Francisco on 24th in the Mission at the center. So on Sunday, July 20th, 9 a.m. to 4 p.m., so a whole day. So stay tuned for that. I'm still kind of working out the specifics of what the retreat will be around and based on. But if you want to spend the day with me meditating, I'd love to see you up in San Francisco. So save the date, and probably next Sunday I'll tell you much more about it. So awesome. All right, everybody, have a wonderful night. Thank you for being here with me and everybody else. And I will see you next time.